Okay, so it's August 5th, and here's what's going on in Ukraine. If you haven't watched yesterday's, please go back and watch yesterday's because a lot of what we talk about today is just simply more evidence of what happened yesterday with the Amnesty International report. I want to start here, though. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the fighting. There's not a lot of the fighting. Not a lot of this will be devoted to the fighting. Most of this will be devoted to the Amnesty report and more that shows this kind of bias. Okay, as far as fighting goes, there's a lot of Russian starts, but not really getting any traction here. But the interesting thing here was that Ukrainian officials confirmed that Russians are now using Iranian-provided drones, which Iran, I think it was July 13th. I don't know why that day sticks out in my head, but Iran denied that they were giving it. Biden showed evidence of the Iranians showing the Russians testing the drones, like satellite images of this, just before his conference with Saudi Arabia. So it's now on the ground, and we know it. Okay, next thing. This is Radio Free Europe, ahead of what could be a major Ukrainian counteroffensive in the area aimed to drive Moscow out of the city of Kherson. So they're scrambling to get ready for the fight in the south. Military experts say Kherson is not as well defended as other regions, although they're moving supplies. The Russians are moving supplies into the area and manpower into the area. Ukrainian troops have already liberated dozens of towns and villages in that area. And here's what we're talking about. We're talking about this region here to try to get toward Kherson city. And so that's where the next major offensive is going to be. It looks like a calm before the storm. This is Al Jazeera, and the only they give a list of what's happening every day. The only thing I want to point out from here is United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he will launch, this is future tense, it's still to come, a fact-finding mission to uncover the truths about a jail where dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war died in bombing strikes last week. Now, if you go back and you look at this, over the last week, we saw who killed the POWs and who killed the POWs. Like this was 5 days ago. The UN has still not had access to where these POWs were held. The Russians said that Ukrainians struck this POW camp, which doesn't sound right. It looks like a false flag operation. We don't know all the details yet, but that's where we are. And this is the relatives of those Ukrainian defenders the relatives of the defenders of Mariupol and Azovstal are calling on the international organizations to help them release their servicemen. Russia does not comply with any international norms, but at the same time it sits at the table with civilized world. It's a good point. So we'll appeal to them to keep working on this. We still don't know what's happening with our relatives. So 53 died, 75 wounded, and their relatives still don't know what happened to them. So that's what happened with the POWs. Let's keep moving. Amnesty International. This was yesterday's thing, was the Amnesty International. And I talked about it. There's bias in this Amnesty International report. There really is bias. Now, the report, and I told you yesterday that the Russians are just going to make hay out of this report because it has great propaganda value. There's a military war, there's a propaganda war, there's an economic war, there's a political war, and it's all stacked together. The report on Ukraine's violations of humanitarian law was based on an extensive investigation. This is not yesterday's news. This is today's news, and they're going to keep working this out. Amnesty International said on Friday that it stands behind a report which accused Kyiv of endangering civilians and placing its military assets in schools. The NGO fully stands by our research. And then they quoted Zelensky, accused the NGO of shifting the responsibility from the aggressor to the victim, equating the actions of the victim and the aggressor in some way, but then said the report, which was released on Thursday, accused Kyiv of a clear violation of international humanitarian law, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, what I also said was that this gets picked up by other media around the world, and this is RT, Russia Today. They know it. This is the state-sponsored Russian media. They know it. Somebody put on my YouTube channel that, who reads Russia Today? Well, apparently it gets picked up because this is High India. Right? Look at this article. It is a cut and paste of the RT article, the report on Ukraine's violation of humanitarian law. NGO fully stands by our research. Earlier, Zelensky accused NGO of shifting the responsibility. The report was released on Thursday, accused Kyiv of a clear violation of humanitarian law. Does that sound familiar? That's because it's just simply cut and paste. So this is high India. I don't know how many people are reading this in India, but that's where they're getting this news. So this is propaganda value because the biased report is putting Ukraine in such a bad light. RT is going to play this all day. So that's what's going on there. And so that's why I said yesterday it's bias in the Amnesty International report, and it's going to be used as propaganda, and it is. Okay, let's talk about something related, more bias that's just not being talked about. Russia's intentions regarding this is, by the way, the UK Ministry of Defense. They put out their daily intelligence update, and it's always worthwhile to read this. Russia's intentions regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remain unclear. Russian forces, by the way, let's go back. So this Amnesty report was talking about how Ukraine, they shouldn't be, they're drawing fire because they're parking their military in schools, and that's bad. Now, not with children in it, empty schools, but still residential kind of neighborhood stuff. And so they're drawing fire, and if they go to a school, that's bad. They shouldn't be doing that because they're drawing fire into a place that they shouldn't be drawing fire. Well, the Russians have parked themselves at a nuclear power plant. So they're at a nuclear power plant, and then they're launching artillery from there, and they're doing the same, more than the same thing, worse than that. But we're not talking about that. Russia's intentions regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remain unclear. Russian forces are probably operating in the regions adjacent to the power station and have used artillery units based on these areas. Russian forces have probably used a wider facility area, in particular the adjacent city of Kandahar, to resist their forces, utilizing the protected status of the nuclear power plant to reduce the risk of their equipment and personnel from overnight Ukrainian attacks. This is Radio Free Europe talking about a similar kind of thing. Ukraine and Russia trade blame on shelling at a nuclear power plant in Donetsk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia must take responsibility for an act of terror. Today, the occupiers have created another extremely risky situation for all in Europe. They struck the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant twice. Any bombarding of this site is shameless act of terror, Zelensky said. Ukraine's state nuclear power plant company said that high voltage power line at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant has been hit by Russian shelling. Russia installed administration said the power lines of the plant had been damaged by Ukraine, so it's kind of a he said. The Russian defense military said Ukraine armed units carried out 3 artillery strikes at the territory of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the city of Kandahar. As a result of the strikes, the hydrogen pipeline was damaged, leading to the fire, ministry said, adding the blaze was quickly extinguished. And the statement by Zelensky's government was committing acts of nuclear terrorism. So, why not talk about this? Now, here's what's going on. Russia fired 60 rockets at Nikopol, damaging 50 residential buildings and leaving some residents without electricity. Military experts quoted in the U.S. media reports say that they believe that Russia is shelling the area intentionally, knowing Ukrainian forces cannot risk returning fire because it could damage the reactors or disturb nuclear sites. So, what Amnesty was complaining about the Ukrainians doing by occupying schools, the Russians are doing in much larger way by sitting on a nuclear power plant and shelling from there. I'll give you some perspective. The nuclear power plant is here, and the Nikopol is right across the river, and so they can just shell them with impunity and not worry about being attacked back. Okay, so, if there's not bias there, I just don't know where bias exists. Zelensky talking about this, the report of Amnesty International that the Ukrainian army allegedly endangers civilian population of the country shifts responsibility from the aggressor to the victim. And I think that's right, because they're talking about, you can't be in a school. They're in a school. Why aren't you in the woods where there's no population? Well, they're in a school defending it because the school at least gives them some protection. No kids are there. They're using the building as, a safer, a fortress of some sort, so that they're not just killed outright in the middle of a field somewhere. That's the thing that got me when I was reading about, well, why aren't they just out in the field fighting the enemy? Because there's no protection and they have tanks. Anyone who amnesties, this is Zelensky talking, anyone who amnesties Russia, who artificially creates such an informational context that some attacks by terrorists are supposedly justified or supposedly understandable, but cannot but realize that it helps terrorists. And if you provide manipulative reports, then you share the responsibility for the death of the people with them. And again, RT writes this article carrying that amnesty report that is then carried by other press outright. Like, I mean, this is just a cut and paste. Okay, so that's what's going on there. Let's go on. There, some good news. 3 vessels with 57,000 tons of corn are finally leaving Odessa. Hopefully they will not be struck or whatever along the way on the way out. Some bad news. Ex-deputy head of intelligence agency in Ukraine was charged with treason, and there are a number of ongoing investigations. This article was really interesting. Putin is banking on a failure of political will in the West, and this is in The Guardian, the British paper The Guardian. The Russo-Ukrainian war is coming down to a race between the weakening political will of Western democracies and the deteriorating military means of Vladimir Putin's dictatorship. So how much will drain out before Russian arms drain out? That's really what it comes down to. It said that Putin was banking or counting on 2 traditional wartime allies, Field Marshal Time and General Winter. The Russian leader is weaponizing energy, reducing gas flows through Nord Stream 1 pipeline so that the winter is going to be cold. And it goes on a little bit further to say Putin's cultural and political analysis of the West leads him to believe that time is on his side. Now, that's a really good question, and some people think that it is, and some people think that it isn't. And here's why. In Germany, a plurality of those asked in a recent poll, 47%, said Ukraine should give up its eastern territories in return for peace. Now, there is a big divide in Europe between people who want just peace at any price, and only peace once you get your territory back, because otherwise bad dictators will do what bad dictators do and keep going. The 2 largest armies in Europe are going to be slogging it out in Ukraine for months and quite probably years to come. It could be a long time, and that is a fair assessment. If we stay the course at scale, then Field Marshal Time will be on Ukraine's side. Putin's stocks of his most modern weapons and best trained troops have already been depleted. Keep up the pressure, and military experts tell us he will be reaching back to 40-year-old tanks and raw recruits. That is very possible, and I believe that this assessment is correct, that the longer this goes without outside intervention like China or somewhere else supplying fresh new tools, or Iran with its drones, whatever, that time is on Ukraine's side, not Russia's side. In democracies, however, leaders must justify and explain to voters the kind of large-scale strategic commitment. Otherwise, they will not support in the long run. And that's the real danger, and that's what Putin is banking on. So just some perspective. Okay, I'm ending with 3 Pravda articles, because Pravda articles are always fun to just understand, like, what's going on in your media. Okay, Pravda.ru. So this is what a English version of what Russians are reading. Russia demands U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe be removed. Okay, U.S. nuclear weapons must be removed from Europe and returned to the territory of the United States, said Andrew Belousov, deputy head of the Russian delegation to the UN. U.S. nuclear weapons must return to their national territory. The infrastructure for their deployment in Europe must be eliminated, and NATO must stop the practice of joint nuclear missions. Okay, well, Anthony Blinken said, look, this is only to be used under emergency circumstances. And the U.S. isn't going around, threatening Russia, like, we're going to go nuke you. Like, Putin has raised this again and again and again. The U.S. doesn't talk like that. Here's some more fun. The Chinese dragon starts breathing fire in Washington's face. Like, even the title of this doesn't sound like journalism, does it? I mean, it sounds like, I don't know, some bad novel or at least a tabloid. Beijing is ready to strengthen its strategic cooperation with the Russian Federation so that together we could more effectively defend the international system in which the UN plays a key role, as well as the order based on the norms of generally accepted international law, said a Chinese diplomat. Okay, But if you go back and watch previous episodes here, you'll hear again and again how they talk about how terrible the rules-based or international order is, and we need to subvert it and convert it. So, okay. Together, the two countries defend equality and justice in the world. Russia and China are the two nations together defending equality and justice around the world. Let that sink in. So they're not happy in China about U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and I haven't really talked about that at any great length. But China's decided to suspend cooperation with the United States in a number of areas: regional military cooperation, climate change cooperation in the fight against drugs, partnership in the field of justice, repatriation, illegal immigration. And they talked about China won't be humiliated by anyone. Yeah, the whole thing with Taiwan seemed to spin out of control unnecessarily. Okay, let's finish this. The national interest, this is Pravda again. The national interest names the place of national interest is a magazine, an article in a magazine, names the place of a possible war between China and U.S. Now, this is Pravda, but I bet you this will be picked up by other magazines again. And so China sent a final warning to the Americans after Nancy Pelosi visited China. The Chinese military immediately began military exercises near the island. More than 100 combat aircraft and 10 destroyers took part in a large-scale training. The Army of China can challenge American dominance in the Pacific. In this regard, the White House is already beginning preparations for a start of a full-scale war, as if the U.S. is trying to start a war with China over Taiwan. The U.S. doesn't want that. And by the way, if you're going to tell us the place of a possible war between China and the U.S., be a little bit more specific than the Pacific. I mean, that's a little broad. Okay, at any rate, that's just more propaganda from Pravda. So my thesis here today was that there has been more and more bias, and here's more evidence of bias. And the way the propaganda is going to be used by Russia is they know it's going to be carried by Indian and Islamic and other papers. And then they aren't even talking about what's going on with the Zaporizhia, like the Amnesty International article didn't even talk about things along these lines. And unless they're even-handed, and they shouldn't be doing this in a separate report. They should have done it in the same report. Say, here's what Ukraine's doing, here's what Russia's doing, so that you can actually see the difference, because Ukraine is clearly the victim in this scenario. Okay, so at any rate, thank you for your time, and we will talk again tomorrow.